In the unforgiving heart of the American West, a lone woman's world was defined by loss and the endless whispering grass of the prairie. But on a blistering afternoon in 1876, a child's cry pierced the silence. It was a sound that would force her to confront not only a pack of hungry coyotes, but the ghosts of her own past and the violent prejudices of an entire town. What began as an act of mercy would ignite a firestorm of suspicion and fear, trapping her between a vengeful sheriff and a silent, watching Lakota tribe, proving that in this land, the most dangerous frontier isn't the horizon. It's the one that runs through the human heart. The sun of late August 1876 beat down on the Dakota Territory with a blacksmith's fury, hammering the parched earth until it cracked in a mosaic of thirst. For Rachel O'Connell, the heat was just another layer of the silence that had pressed in on her since Thomas was buried. Her small homestead, a lonely sodden timber sentinel near the winding path of a mostly dry creek, was her entire world. It was a world of ghosts, the ghost of her husband's laughter in the whisper of the wind through the eaves, the ghost of his strength in the solid feel of the axe handle she now wielded herself. Thomas had been a soldier, a man who believed in order and the firm line of a map. He saw this land as something to be tamed, a wild canvas awaiting the civilizing brushstroke of fence posts and plows. He'd been killed in a skirmish a year prior, a small, nameless clash with a band of Lakota that never made the papers, but had torn the center out of Rachel's life. Now she was left with his dream, and the bitter irony that she was living on the very edge of the land that had claimed him, the great sprawling expanse of the Sioux Reservation, just over the hazy ridges of the Black Hills. On this particular afternoon, she was mending a fence line, the rhythmic thud of her hammer, a lonely heartbeat against the vast emptiness. Sweat plastered her calico dress to her skin and stung her eyes. It was then she heard it. At first it was barely a sound, thin and reedy, easily mistaken for the cry of a hawk. But it came again, sharper this time, laced with a thread of pure terror that cut through the afternoon's oppressive stillness. It was a child. Rachel froze her hand, gripping the hammer. Her first instinct, born of a year of solitude and fear, was to retreat. Nothing good came from the unfamiliar in this land. The nearby settlement of Redemption Creek was a full day's ride, and its people were wary, their kindnesses rationed and their suspicions plentiful. Out here, you were your own law, your own doctor, your own savior. Stray sounds were portents, and a child's cry could be a lure. Stories of ambushes were common currency in town, traded over barrels of flour and sacks of beans. But the cry came again, a desperate, hiccuping sob that snagged on something deep inside her, a maternal instinct she never knew she possessed. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated helplessness. Cursing her own softness, Rachel shaded her eyes and scanned the landscape. The sound was coming from a dense thicket of cottonwoods and wild plums down by the creek bed. She grabbed the Winchester rifle, leaning against the fence post. It was Thomas's rifle, heavy and well-oiled, and she knew how to use it. Moving with a practiced quietness that the prairie had taught her, she made her way towards the trees, the dry grass crunching under her boots. As she drew closer, the crying was joined by another sound, a low guttural yipping and snarling that made the hairs on her arms stand on end. Coyotes. Not a lone scavenger, but a pack emboldened by hunger and the scent of easy prey. She pushed through a curtain of willow branches and saw the scene. A small boy, no older than 5 or 6, was backed against the gnarled roots of an ancient cottonwood. He was Lakota. His face streaked with dirt, and tears was a mask of terror. He wore only a buckskin breechcloth and worn moccasins, his dark hair matted with sweat. In his small clenched fist, he clutched a leather pouch. Circling him, their movements fluid and predatory, were 4 coyotes. They were gaunt, their ribs showing their yellow eyes fixed on the child. One darted in, snapping its jaws, and the boy shrieked, pressing himself harder against the tree. All the stories, all the warnings from the folks in Redemption Creek, all the bitterness she held over Thomas's death, it all evaporated in the face of the raw, primal scene before her. This wasn't a warrior. This wasn't a threat. This was a child, terrified and alone, about to be torn apart. Without thinking, Rachel raised the Winchester to her shoulder. She didn't want to fire a shot that would echo for miles a dinner bell for any unwanted attention. She aimed high above the lead coyote's head and squeezed the trigger. The crack of the rifle was a thunderclap in the quiet grove. The bullet splintered a branch overhead, sending a shower of leaves down. The coyotes, shocked by the sudden violence, scattered. They paused at the edge of the clearing, whining and uncertain, their predatory hunger warring with their instinct for self-preservation. Rachel took a steadying breath and worked the lever, the smooth metallic shuck, shuck, a sound of authority. She took a step forward into the clearing. "Get on!" she yelled, her voice hoarse but firm. "Git!" She fired again this time, kicking up a plume of dust just in front of the boldest coyote. That was enough. With a final volley of frustrated yips, the pack melted back into the tall grass and disappeared. Silence descended once more, broken only by the boy's ragged, fearful gasps. His wide, dark eyes were now fixed on her. On the rifle. Rachel slowly, deliberately lowered the weapon, setting the butt on the ground. She held up her empty hands to show she meant no harm. "It's all right," she said, softly, her voice barely a whisper. "They're gone now. You're safe." The boy didn't understand her words, but he understood the shift in her tone. He remained pressed against the tree, his small chest heaving. He was trembling violently, either from fear or the beginnings of shock. Rachel could see now that his knee was scraped and bleeding, and a long scratch ran down his arm. She knew what she had to do, and she knew it was the most dangerous decision she had made since she'd decided to stay on this land after Thomas's death. Leaving him here was a death sentence. The coyotes, or worse, would be back. Taking him to Redemption Creek would be like throwing a lit match into a powder keg. The townsfolk, especially Sheriff Brody, saw any native as an enemy, a child no less than a warrior. They'd likely lock him up, or worse, use him as a pawn. That left only one option, an option that made her blood run cold. She had to take him back to her cabin. She had to bring a Lakota child, the son of the very people she blamed for her widowhood, into her home. Slowly, she took a step closer. "I'm not going to hurt," she murmured, keeping her movement slow and non-threatening. She knelt, making herself smaller, less imposing. She pointed to herself. "Rachel." Then she pointed towards her cabin, a faint silhouette on the rise. "Home. Food." The boy just stared, his eyes bottomless pools of fear and confusion. He was lost. Terribly, dangerously lost. How far had he wandered? Where was his family, his tribe? They would be searching for him, and their mood would be anything but friendly towards a white woman, they found with their missing child. "Come on, now," she urged, gently beckoning with her hand. "We need to get that knee cleaned up. It's getting dark soon." He didn't move. Rachel sighed. She couldn't force him. She stood up, slung the rifle over her shoulder, and began to walk slowly back towards the homestead, glancing back over her shoulder. For a moment, she thought he would stay rooted to the spot. But then, after a long, agonizing pause, he took a hesitant step away from the tree. Then another. He followed her, keeping a careful distance of 20 feet, his eyes darting nervously between her back and the shadows gathering in the tall grass. As they walked across the darkening prairie, two solitary figures against a blood-red sunset. Rachel O'Connell felt a profound and terrifying shift in the very ground beneath her feet. She had just saved a life, but she had a sinking feeling she may have just forfeited her own. The inside of the cabin was cast in the warm, flickering glow of a tallow lamp. It was a single room, but Rachel kept it meticulously clean. A cast-iron stove, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, a small cupboard, and her bed in the corner made up the furnishings. On a small shelf above the hearth sat the only picture she owned, a faded tintype of her and Thomas on their wedding day. His soldier's uniform crisp, her smile achingly young. The boy stood hesitantly, just inside the doorway, as if the threshold itself were a barrier he was terrified to cross. He looked impossibly small in the small space. Rachel ignored him for a moment, busying herself by stoking the fire in the stove and putting a pot of water on to heat. She moved with a deliberate calmness she did not feel. "All right, let's have a look at you," she said, turning to him with a basin of warm water and a clean rag. She knelt before him again, her movements slow. He flinched when she reached for his leg, but didn't pull away. He watched her with an unnerving intensity as she gently cleaned the dirt and dried blood from the gash on his knee. His skin was the color of rich earth, and he was leaner than any white child she'd ever seen, all sinew and bone. When she finished with his knee, she dabbed at the long scratch on his arm. He winced but remained silent, his gaze unwavering. The silence in the cabin was thick, punctuated only by the crackle of the fire and the boy's soft breathing. It was a different kind of silence than the one she was used to. It was alive, filled with unspoken questions, and a tension that hummed in the air like a plucked wire. Hunger was a universal language. Rachel cut a thick slice of the dense bread she'd baked 2 days ago, and held it out to him. He stared at it, then at her suspicion warring with need in his young face. She took a small bite from her own piece to show it was safe. Hesitantly, he took the offering and nibbled at the edge. Soon his hunger won out, and he devoured it ravenously. She then gave him a bowl of the thin venison stew left over from the night before. He ate quickly, messily, his eyes never leaving her. As he ate, Rachel's eyes fell upon the small leather pouch he still clutched in his hand. He'd held on to it throughout the entire ordeal. Curiosity got the better of her. "What do you have there?" she asked softly, gesturing towards it. The boy looked down at the pouch, his meal forgotten. He clutched it tighter. Seeing his reaction, Rachel immediately regretted asking. But after a moment's hesitation, he did something that surprised her. He loosened the drawstring, and with a solemnity that seemed too old for his small frame, tipped the contents into his palm. It was an assortment of a child's treasures, a smooth grey river stone, a vibrant blue jay feather, and a small, intricately carved wooden horse. But there was something else, something that didn't belong. It was metal and it glinted in the lamplight. Rachel's breath caught in her throat. It was a compass, a brass military-issue compass, and on its lid she could just make out the engraved initials CRM and the insignia of the 7th Cavalry. A cold dread washed over her, far colder than the fear she'd felt facing the Coyotes. This wasn't just any compass. She knew those initials. Charles R. Miller, Lieutenant Miller. He was Doc Miller's nephew, a young, ambitious officer stationed at Fort Lincoln. He had ridden out with a small patrol 2 months ago to survey the western edge of the hills. They had never returned. The official report said they were lost, presumed dead, but everyone knew what that meant. Sheriff Brody had led a posse to search for them, finding only tracks that led deep into Sioux territory, and then vanished. Brody had been a close friend of the lieutenant's family. How did this boy come to have it? The innocent scene of a woman tending to a lost child shattered. Suddenly, the cabin felt like a trap. The boy was no longer just a boy. He was a link to violence, to death, to the very conflict that had made her a widow. Had his father, his brother, been part of the band that had attacked Miller's patrol? Was this a trophy? The boy, seeing the look on her face, quickly scooped the items back into his pouch, his expression turning fearful again. Rachel stood up abruptly and walked to the window, peering out into the impenetrable darkness. Her mind raced. What was she harboring? The compass changed everything. It was evidence. It was a death warrant. If Sheriff Brody ever found this boy here, with this compass, he wouldn't see a lost child. He would see proof. He would see a savage spawn, and her as a traitorous accomplice. She spent the night in a chair by the cold hearth, the Winchester across her lap, while the boy slept fitfully on a pallet of blankets she'd laid out near the stove. Sleep offered her no escape. Her dreams were a chaotic swirl of Thomas's face, Lieutenant Miller's laughing eyes, from the one time she'd met him in town, and the boy's dark, accusing stare. By the grey light of dawn, she had made a decision. She couldn't keep him here, and she couldn't simply turn him loose. She had to go to town. Not to the sheriff, not yet. She needed advice from someone with a cooler head. She needed Doc Miller. He was a man of science and reason, and he more than anyone deserved to know about the compass. After giving the boy more bread and a cup of water, she faced the problem of leaving him. She couldn't take him with her. She tried to explain with gestures, pointing to herself, then the door, then holding up one finger and pointing to the sun's path, trying to indicate she would be back soon. He just stared blankly. With a heavy heart, she did the only thing she could think of. She led him outside to the root cellar, a small, dark space dug into the hillside, cool and secure. It felt like a betrayal locking him in, but the alternative, leaving him in the cabin with the door unbarred, was too risky. She placed a jug of water and the rest of the bread inside with him. His eyes widened in terror as she closed the heavy wooden door, and she thought she heard a small cry as she slid the thick iron bolt into place. The sound tore at her. "I'll be back," she whispered to the unhearing door. "I promise." The ride to Redemption Creek was agonizing. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like a war cry. When she finally saw the dusty cluster of buildings, she felt a sliver of relief that was quickly extinguished by a new wave of anxiety. Redemption Creek was a town built on suspicion. Men wore their pistols like jewelry, and their distrust like a second skin. As she tied her horse to the rail outside Doc Miller's office, She could feel the eyes on her. Mrs. Gable, the postmistress, and town's foremost gossip peered at her from the window of the general store, her expression a mixture of curiosity and disapproval. Rachel was the widow who lived too close to the territories, the woman who kept to herself. Her isolation made her an object of speculation. Doc Miller was a gaunt man in his late 50s, with kind, tired eyes and hands stained with iodine. He listened patiently as Rachel, her voice low and urgent, recounted the entire story, leaving out no detail from the Coyotes to the compass. He paled when she mentioned the initials. He picked up a framed photograph from his desk. It showed a young man in a cavalry uniform, the same Lieutenant Miller. "Charles." The doctor murmured, his voice thick with emotion. He was silent for a long moment, staring at the photo. "What do I do, doctor?" Rachel pleaded. "I can't keep him, but if I take him to the sheriff—" Doc Miller sighed, the sound heavy with the weight of the world. "You've stumbled into a hornet's nest, Rachel. A hornet's nest in the middle of a rattlesnake pit." He looked her straight in the eye. "Brody cannot be your first stop. He's a good lawman for breaking up saloon fights, but his judgment is clouded by grief and hatred. He sees the world in black and white. He'll see the boy and the compass, and he'll see a confession. So what do I do? You did the right thing coming to me," he said, his voice gaining a measure of resolve. "But the law is the law. You have to report it. We will go to Brody together. I will try to make him see reason. I will vouch for your character." He took a deep breath. "But you must give him the compass. It's evidence in the disappearance of a cavalry officer. Withholding it is a federal crime." Rachel's heart sank. She had hoped for another solution, any other solution. Their walk to the sheriff's office was a public spectacle. Mrs. Gable was now openly standing on her porch, watching. Two prospectors stopped their conversation to stare. By the time they reached the small clapboard building with its barred windows, Rachel felt like a condemned prisoner on her way to the gallows. Sheriff Marcus Brody was a big man, built like a bull with a weathered face and pale, cold eyes that missed nothing. He was cleaning a Colt revolver at his desk, and he didn't bother to stand when they entered. "Doc, Mrs. O'Connell." He grunted, his voice like gravel. "What trouble brings you out from your homestead?" The question was not friendly. Doc Miller began to explain, but Brody's eyes were locked on Rachel. He listened with a stony impatience, his jaw tightening. When the doc finished, Brody held out a hand. "The compass." Rachel's hands trembled as she retrieved it from her pocket and placed it in his large, calloused palm. Brody flipped it over. He saw the initials. A muscle twitched in his cheek. His eyes, when they rose to meet Rachel's, were devoid of all reason. They were filled with a chilling, absolute certainty. "Where is the boy?" he demanded, his voice dangerously low. "He is safe at my homestead," Rachel said, her voice barely a whisper. "Safe?" Brody scoffed, a cruel smirk twisting his lips. "You find a Sioux whelp with my friend's compass, a boy whose kin likely murdered Charlie, and you give him shelter, you feed him." He stood up, his sheer size filling the small office. He leaned over the desk, his face inches from hers. "Tell me, Mrs. O'Connell," he snarled, "what did they pay you, furs gold, or just the promise that they'll burn your neighbors' homesteads and leave yours standing?" "That's outrageous, Marcus," Doc Miller interjected, stepping forward. "She saved the boy's life. She came straight here to do the right thing." "The right thing." Brody laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. The right thing would have been to leave him for the Coyotes or to put a bullet in him herself. She is harboring an enemy. She is in possession of stolen property from a murdered officer. As far as I'm concerned, that makes her an accomplice. He pointed a thick finger at Rachel. You go back to that homestead. You don't go anywhere else. I'll be out there before nightfall with a posse to collect the prisoner and take your full statement. And it had better be a good one. He picked up the compass and dropped it into his pocket. Now get out of my office. Rachel stumbled out into the blinding sunlight, her legs weak. Doc Miller followed, his face grim. The door to the sheriff's office slammed shut behind them, a sound of absolute finality. A door had closed on her old life, and in the oppressive, judgmental silence of redemption. Creek, Rachel O'Connell knew she was utterly, terrifyingly alone. The ride back to the homestead was a blur of dust and dread. Sheriff Brody's words echoed in Rachel's mind, each one a hammer blow against her fleeting hope of a peaceful resolution. Accomplice, traitor, prisoner. The sun, which had been a source of oppressive heat that morning, now felt like a giant accusatory eye in the sky. The familiar landscape of her own land had transformed into something alien and hostile. Every rock formation seemed to be a potential hiding place for a posse. Every rustle in the grass sounded like the approach of judgment. When she reached the crest of the hill overlooking her cabin, she pulled her horse to a halt. The homestead looked just as she had left it, a small, defiant outpost against the wilderness. But now it felt different. It was no longer a sanctuary. It was a curse, and the bars were closing in. Dismounting, she hurried to the root cellar, her heart pounding with a mixture of guilt and fear. "I'm back," she called out, her voice trembling as she fumbled with the heavy bolt. "I'm here." She pulled the door open. The boy was huddled in the far corner, his knees drawn up to his chest. He looked up at her, his dark eyes wood and full of a quiet, watchful fear. He hadn't touched the water or the bread. The sight of his stoic misery was a fresh stab of guilt. She had locked him in the dark, a terrified child. And for what? To be handed over to a man like Brody. "Come on," she said, softly extending a hand. "Let's get you out of there." He hesitated for only a second before scrambling out into the sunlight, blinking against the brightness. Back inside the cabin, the oppressive tension from the morning returned. He watched her every move as she paced the small room, her mind a whirlwind of impossible choices. Brody was coming. That was a certainty. He would come with men who shared his hatred and suspicion, men who would see what they wanted to see. They would take the boy. What would they do with him? Hand him over to the army at Fort Lincoln, hold him in the town's flimsy jail cell. He was a child, but in the brutal calculus of the frontier, he was also a liability, a symbol. His life would be worth very little to them. And what of her? Brody had all but convicted her in his office. He would twist her act of compassion into a story of collusion. The compass was his proof. Her isolation, her proximity to the reservation, it all fit his narrative. She would lose everything. The homestead. Thomas had bled for her freedom, perhaps even her life. She stopped pacing and looked at the boy. He was watching her, his head tilted. In his eyes, she saw not an enemy, but the same fear that was churning in her own gut. They were two captives in the same trap, each a threat to the other, yet bound by a shared vulnerability. Her gaze drifted to the window, scanning the long, sloping ridge to the west that marked the informal boundary of the Sioux lands. And then she saw them. At first they were just specks, heat shimmering off the distant rise. but they were moving, resolving themselves into definite shapes. 3 riders. They were too far to see clearly, but their posture, the way they sat their ponies with an easy, fluid grace, told her everything she needed to know. They were not settlers. They were not soldiers. They were Lakota, a search party, his people. A new, sharper fear pierced through her panic. They would be tracking him. They would follow his trail here to her cabin. What would they think when they found him? Would they see her as his savior or his captor? Would they listen to her story? Or would they see a lone white woman, a rifle and their missing child, and leap to the same violent conclusions as Brody? She grabbed the boy's arm, her grip tighter than she intended. "We have to hide," she whispered urgently, pulling him towards the back of the cabin, where a loose floorboard concealed a small crawl space for storing potatoes and other goods through the winter. It was cramped and smelled of damp earth. He resisted, his eyes fixed on the window on the riders. A flicker of something she hadn't seen before crossed his face, not fear, but recognition. Hope. He let out a small, sharp cry, a sound of longing. "No, hush," Rachel hissed, clamping a hand gently over his mouth. "They can't see you. They can't see you here." She didn't know if she was protecting him from them or herself from them. The two motives were hopelessly entangled. With a strength born of desperation, she half lifted, half pushed him down into the crawl space and lowered herself in after him, pulling the floorboard back into place. Darkness enveloped them, thick and suffocating. A few slivers of light filtered through the cracks between the boards, striping the dirt floor. The boy was trembling beside her, and she could hear his rapid, shallow breaths. She put an arm around his small shoulders, an instinctive gesture of comfort that was as much for her as it was for him. He stiffened at her touch, but didn't pull away. Through a crack, she could just see the ridge. The riders had stopped. They sat motionless on their horses, surveying the valley, surveying her cabin. They were a portrait of patient menace. One of them raised a hand and pointed directly at the homestead. They had found the trail. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Rachel held her breath, listening. The silence was absolute. What were they doing? Were they circling? Were they waiting for more of their party to arrive? Her imagination filled the void with terrifying possibilities. She thought of Thomas, of the stories he'd told of the sudden, shocking violence of an ambush. The boy beside her began to stir. He squirmed, trying to get a better look through the cracks. He knew his people were out there. He wanted to go to them. He let out a soft whimper. "Shh." Rachel breathed her lips close to his ear. "Be still. Please be still." To her surprise, he seemed to understand. He subsided, pressing against her side. In the shared darkness, trapped between two looming threats, a fragile truce was forged. They were no longer Rachel O'Connell and a Lakota boy. They were just two living creatures hiding from predators. Hours crawled by. The light filtering through the cracks shifted from the white-hot glare of afternoon to the soft gold of evening. The Lakota riders had not moved. They were waiting. But for what? For darkness. Then a new sound reached them, the rhythmic thud of multiple horses approaching from the east, from the direction of Redemption Creek. Brody. Rachel's blood ran cold. He had arrived, and he had brought his posse. She peeked through the crack again. She could see them now, a line of 8 men, their shapes stark against the setting sun. Brody was at their head, his shotgun held ready across his saddle. They were riding with grim purpose, kicking up a cloud of dust that settled over the prairie like a shroud. She was caught. The Lakota on the ridge, the posse in the valley. Her small cabin was the epicenter of a standoff that was about to explode. From the east, a harsh voice shattered the evening stillness. "Rachel O'Connell, this is Sheriff Brody. We know you're in there, and we know who you've got with you. Come on out with your hands empty." The boy jumped at the sound of the angry voice. Rachel held him tighter, her own heart hammering against her ribs. "You've got 1 minute to open that door, woman," Brody yelled, "or we're coming in." Rachel knew he meant it. She could hear the creak of saddle leather as the men dismounted, the metallic click of hammers being cocked. They were surrounding the cabin. She looked from this approaching posse to the silent, watching figures on the ridge. A desperate, insane idea began to form in her mind. It was a gamble so reckless it defied all logic. But staying hidden meant being found by Brody, and that was a certainty of doom. The riders on the hill were an unknown, a terrible, frightening unknown, but an unknown nonetheless. "I have the boy," Brody shouted again, his voice raw with impatience. "Send him out, and I might just convince the judge you were a confused, simple-minded woman instead of a traitorous snake." His words solidified her decision. He would show no mercy. He wanted a villain, and he had already cast her in the role. There was a loud bang as the butt of a rifle slammed against her door. "Time's up, Mrs. O'Connell." Just as a heavy boot was about to crash against the wood, a sound pierced the air high and sharp, like the whistle of a bird of prey. It was followed by a solid, sickening thud. Silence. Then one of the posse members outside yelled, "My God, an arrow!" Rachel risked another look. Sticking out of her cabin door, just inches from where Brody's head would have been, was an arrow. Its dark shaft quivered with the force of its impact. The posse scrambled for cover, shouting in alarm. Sheriff Brody, his face a mask of fury and shock, stared up at the ridge. The 3 riders were still there, but one of them now held a bow. They had made their move. The trap had been sprung, and Rachel O'Connell, huddled in the darkness beneath her floor, was right in the center of its jaws. The arrow in the door changed everything. It was not an act of aggression, but a declaration. A line had been drawn. The air, already thick with tension, now vibrated with the promise of imminent violence. Outside, Brody's men had taken cover behind the water trough and the woodpile, their rifles aimed at the ridge. The evening light bled from the sky, casting long, menacing shadows that seemed to writhe and twist. "Hold your fire!" Brody bellowed, his voice tight with a rage that was barely contained. "Don't give them an excuse!" He glared up at the 3 distant figures who remained as still and silent as stone carvings. They had made their point. They were watching. They were ready. Inside the crawl space, Rachel knew her time had run out. Staying hidden was no longer an option. The conflict was here on her doorstep. Brody would eventually storm the cabin, and the Lakota would likely answer that violence with their own. Her home would become a battlefield, and she and the boy would be the first casualties. She looked at the child beside her. His fear was gone, replaced by a strange, focused calm. He was listening not to the shouting of the posse, but to the vast, ringing silence from the ridge. He was connected to it, and to them, by a bond she could not comprehend. In that moment of clarity, Rachel understood what she had to do. It was the only move left on the board, a move of terrifying audacity. She could not be a pawn for Brody or a captive for the Lakota. She had to become an actor in this drama, the one who chose the next scene. "We're going out," she whispered to the boy. He looked at her, his eyes wide in the gloom. She offered no further explanation, but pushed up on the floorboard. It scraped loudly in the tense quiet. "She's in there, I heard something," one of the posse men shouted. Before Brody could respond, Rachel stood up, emerging from the floor like a ghost. She blinked in the dim lamplight of the cabin, then walked to the boy and took his hand. His small fingers wrapped around hers, a trusting gesture that sent a pang through her heart. "Stay close to me," she said, her voice steady, despite the tremor in her soul. She took a deep breath, walked to the door, and lifted the heavy crossbar. The wood groaned in protest. She pulled the door inward. The scene outside was a frozen tableau of hatred. Sheriff Brody stood 20 feet away, his face contorted in a snarl of disbelief and fury. His men were crouched, their rifles leveled, their knuckles white. The last rays of sunset caught the polished steel of their gun barrels. Rachel stepped out onto the porch into the space between the two fires. She did not raise her hands in surrender. She stood straight, her chin up, holding the Lakota boy's hand. He did not shrink behind her, but stood beside her, a small, defiant figure in the dying light. She was not presenting a captive. She was presenting a child she had protected. A collective gasp went through the posse. Brody's jaw dropped. This was not the scene he had expected. He had anticipated a cowering woman, a hostage situation, a confession. He had not anticipated this quiet, dignified defiance. For a long moment, no one moved. The world seemed to hold its breath. Then from the ridge, a single powerful voice called out a cry that was both a name and a prayer. The boy at Rachel's side answered his own small voice, clear and strong in the twilight. The effect was instantaneous. The three riders on the ridge urged their horses forward, cascading down the long slope, not with the wild charge of an attack, but with a powerful, focused urgency. As they drew closer, Rachel could see them clearly. They were not just warriors. They were men whose faces were etched with anxiety and grief. The man in the lead who had called out was powerfully built. His face a mask of stern authority that now cracked with raw emotion. He wore a single eagle feather in his hair, and his eyes were fixed on the boy. Brody raised his shotgun. "That's far enough," he roared. But his authority was gone. His men were mesmerized by the approaching Lakota, their certainty shaken by Rachel's actions. The lead rider did not stop until he was at the edge of the cleared ground around the cabin. He swung off his pony in a single fluid motion. His eyes swept over the scene, the posse the arrow in the door. Rachel standing firm, and finally his son. The boy let go of Rachel's hand and ran stumbling into his father's arms. The warrior enveloped the child in a fierce embrace, burying his face in the boy's dark hair. All the sternness fell away from him, replaced by a wave of profound, overwhelming relief. He held his son at arm's length, checking him for injuries. His hands gentle, his words spoken in a low, rumbling Lakota that was both a question and a reassurance. The boy responded, pointing to his scraped knee. Then to Rachel, then chattering in a fast, excited stream of words. The warrior, the boy's father, looked at Rachel. His gaze was intense, penetrating. He was reading her reading, the entire story in her posture, in the way his son stood near her without fear, in the defiant set of her jaw, against the backdrop of Brody's armed posse. He saw the basin of water still on the porch where she'd cleaned the boy's wounds. He saw the half-eaten piece of bread on the railing. And he saw the arrow, his arrow not in her, but in her door, A shield, not a weapon. His eyes flicked to Sheriff Brody, and the warmth vanished, replaced by a cold, hard glare that was more intimidating than any weapon. He said nothing, but the message was clear. You were a threat to my son. She was not. He then turned back to Rachel. He gave a short, sharp nod. It was not a gesture of friendship. It was a gesture of profound, grudging respect, an acknowledgement of a debt. He said something to one of the other riders who dismounted, and with a powerful tug pulled the arrow from the door. With the boy safely held in his arms, the father mounted his horse. The 3 Lakota turned and rode away. Not back up the ridge, but melting into the darkening prairie, their movements silent and swift. They were gone as quickly as they had appeared. The prairie was suddenly deafeningly quiet. The posse slowly stood up, their rifles now seeming absurdly large and useless. They looked at Brody, then at Rachel, their expressions a mixture of confusion, awe, and a dawning sense of shame. Sheriff Brody was left standing alone in the dust. His authority shattered, his narrative of hate and betrayal, undone by a simple act of courage. He looked at Rachel, his eyes filled with a venomous, humiliated rage. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. There was nothing to say. He had been outmaneuvered and exposed. Without another word, he turned, holstered his shotgun, and strode to his horse. Let's go, he bit out to his men. The posse, avoiding Rachel's eyes, mounted up and followed him, a silent, defeated procession riding back into the night. Rachel remained on the porch until the sound of their hoofbeats had faded completely. She leaned against the rough-hewn post, her legs finally giving way to a wave of exhaustion, so profound it was like a physical blow. She looked at the hole in her door, a small, dark circle that marked the moment her world had irrevocably changed. She had stood between 2 fires and had not been burned. The next morning, she awoke to a world washed clean by the dawn. When she opened her door, she stopped, her breath catching in her chest. On her doorstep, laid out with deliberate care, were gifts. There was a magnificent buffalo robe, thick and soft, the hide tanned to a perfect supple cream color. Beside it lay several large cuts of dried venison, wrapped in clean buckskin. Next to that was a collection of herbs and roots, tied in a bundle, plants she recognized from her mother's old herbal lore as powerful medicines for healing and strength, and resting in the center of the buffalo robe was the arrow. The fearsome sharpened flint arrowhead had been removed. In its place, tied with a sinew cord, was a single perfect eagle feather, a symbol of courage, honor, and peace. Lying next to it, gleaming in the morning sun, was Lieutenant Miller's brass compass. They were returning it. They were absolving her. They knew what it was, knew the trouble it represented, and they were severing her connection to it. The gifts were not payment. They were a statement, a thank you, a message of respect sent across a chasm of hatred and fear. Rachel knelt and touched the soft fur of the robe, tears welling in her eyes. They were not tears of fear or loneliness. They were tears of a strange, fierce, and heartbreaking hope. On the vast, empty prairie, a silent understanding had been reached. The gifts on the doorstep were not a secret for long. In a place like Redemption Creek, where every stray cow and unusual dust cloud was a topic for discussion, a pile of Lakota goods on the porch of the reclusive widow was a bombshell. The first to arrive was Doc Miller, his buggy kicking up dust as he urged his horse on. He had heard the posse's grumbled, fragmented stories when they'd slunk back into town late last night. He found Rachel sitting on her porch step, the buffalo robe draped over her shoulders, sipping coffee as the sun climbed the sky. The compass sat on the railing beside her. He took in the scene, the gifts, the hole in the door, the newfound steel in Rachel's gaze. My God, Rachel. He breathed, his tired eyes wide, with a mixture of fear and admiration. The stories, they were true. More or less, Rachel said, her voice quiet but firm. She recounted the standoff, her decision to walk out the father's reunion with his son. When she pointed to the compass, Doc Miller picked it up, his fingers tracing the initials of his lost nephew. They returned it, he murmured, his voice thick. They knew what it would mean for you. He looked at her, his expression clearing with a dawning understanding. This wasn't payment, Rachel. This was an act of honor. They were repaying a debt and protecting the fan who had helped them. But Redemption Creek was not populated by men like Doc Miller. Later that day, Sheriff Brody returned. He was alone this time, his face a thunderous mask. He saw the gifts and his lip curled in a sneer. So, he spat, his voice dripping with sarcasm. The savages brought their little collaborator her reward. They are a thank you, Sheriff, Rachel said, rising to her feet. She was no longer intimidated by him. The fear had been burned out of her the night before. For saving a child's life. That's a payment for services rendered, is what that is. Brody jabbed a finger towards the gifts. That's proof you're in league with them. You probably told them where Miller's patrol was going. This compass. He snatched it from the railing. They only gave it back because they knew you were compromised. His accusations were loud, desperate, and nonsensical, but they were aimed not just at her, but at the two prospectors who had followed him out from town, their curiosity getting the better of them. They watched from a distance, their faces clouded with suspicion. It was then that Doc Miller, who had been checking on Rachel's horse in the corral, stepped forward. That's enough, Marcus, he said, his voice carrying the calm authority of a man used to dealing with hysterics. You stay out of this, Doc, Brody warned. I will not, the doctor said, stepping between Brody and Rachel. He addressed not the sheriff, but the watching prospectors. Use your heads, you two. Think about it. If Mrs. O'Connell was a spy, if she was their accomplice, why on earth would they return the one piece of evidence that ties them to my nephew's disappearance? Why lead the sheriff right to it? It makes no sense. He held up a hand, ticking off the points. She found a lost boy. She protected him from coyotes. She cleaned his wounds. She came to me, and then to the law to do the right thing. She stood her ground when this man, he gestured to Brody, was ready to burn her house down around her, and the boy's father, seeing his son was safe and cared for, showed his gratitude. Those aren't the actions of traitors and spies. They are the actions of decent human beings on both sides. He turned his gaze on Brody, and his voice dropped, laced with contempt. You, on the other hand, Marcus, you were so blinded by your own hate, you were willing to condemn an innocent woman and endanger a child. You saw a monster where there was only a mother's instinct. The only shame here today is yours. The prospectors looked at each other, then at Brody. The sheriff's face was flush with rage. But Doc Miller's logic was undeniable. Doubt began to seed in their expressions. Brody had lost his audience. He had lost the argument. He stood there, sputtering, the compass clutched in his hand like a useless talisman. Finally defeated, he spun on his heel and stormed back to his horse, leaving the compass and his credibility lying in the dust. The story of that day and the night before became a legend in Redemption Creek. It was told and retold in the saloon and the general store, evolving with each telling. Rachel O'Connell was no longer just the reclusive widow. She was the woman who faced down Brody, the woman the Sioux respected. Some, like Mrs. Gable, still whispered that she was unnatural, too comfortable with the wildness of the land and its people. But for most, she had earned a new, more profound status. She was a woman of substance, of unshakable courage. She never saw the boy again. She never spoke to his father. But the understanding remained. The gifts were a constant reminder. She used the buffalo robe through the harsh Dakota winter, its warmth a comfort against the howling wind. She used the herbs Doc Miller helped her identify, and the food saw her through the leanest months. The compass she gave to the doctor who kept it on his desk next to his nephew's photograph, a reminder not only of his loss, but of the unexpected complexities of grace. Life for Rachel was never the same. The silence of her homestead was no longer one of loneliness, but of peace. She was no longer just a widow, a survivor clinging to the ghost of her husband's dream. She was a part of the land now in a way Thomas, with his maps and his fences, could never have been. She understood its harshness, but also its capacity for strange and powerful moments of connection. Months later, as the first snows of winter began to dust the Black Hills, she was splitting firewood when she felt a familiar prickle on her neck. She looked up at the western ridge. A lone rider sat on his pony, a stark silhouette against the grey sky. It was him, the boy's father. He was too far away to see her face, and she his. He raised a hand, not in a wave, but in a slow, deliberate gesture of acknowledgement, of respect. Rachel stopped her work, leaned her axe against the woodpile, and raised her own hand in return. The rider watched her for a long moment more, then turned his pony and disappeared back into the vast white wilderness of his own world. Rachel stood there for a long time, the cold air crisp in her lungs. A fragile peace had been forged, not by treaties or laws, but by a single act of compassion in a cottonwood grove. In the heart of a vast and violent land, she had found her own kind of bravery and her own kind of home. Thank you for joining us on this journey back to the heart of the Old West. The story of Rachel O'Connell is a powerful reminder that history is not just made in famous battles or by famous men, but in the quiet, courageous choices of ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances. It shows us that even in the most divided of times, a single act of compassion can echo louder than a gunshot. If this story moved you, please help us share it by hitting that like button. It truly helps our channel grow. And for more true tales of defiance, survival, and the untold stories of the American frontier, be sure to click subscribe and ring that notification bell. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What part of Rachel's story resonated with you the most? Thanks for watching, and we'll see you on the next trail.